After my husband's funeral, I went to my sister's son's first birthday party, and she announced that a single sentence spoken in a sun-drenched living room can shatter the fragile peace you've built from grief. This is a story about the secrets families keep, the promises we break, and the day I learned that the dead can speak, often through the living. If you find yourself drawn to stories that unravel the deepest secrets of the human heart, consider subscribing. I promise the journey we're about to take is one you won't soon forget. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 68 years old. The story I am about to tell you is my own. It belongs to the tapestry of my life, a thread of such startling color that it forever changed the pattern of everything I thought I knew. It begins in the hollowed-out quiet that follows a great loss, in the days when the world feels muffled, as if wrapped in thick felt. The black dress I had worn to bury Robert still hung over the chair in my bedroom, a shapeless shadow of a thing. The scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements clung to the air in my small house, a cloying, sweet smell of death that I couldn't seem to air out. It had been 3 days. 3 days of silence, of casseroles left on the porch by well-meaning neighbors, of the unbearable emptiness of my side of the bed. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the stillness. It was my younger sister, Caroline. "Ellie," she said, her voice a forced, bright chirp, "you're coming on Saturday for Liam's birthday. You need to be around people." I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool wall. "Caroline, I can't. I'm not up for a party." "It's not a party. It's a small gathering. Just family. For Liam. He needs his Aunt Ellie." Her tone brooked no argument, the same tone she'd used since we were children, when she decided she knew what was best for both of us. Robert had never cared much for Caroline. He called her the General in pearls. The memory of his voice saying it, warm with wry amusement, was a fresh ache. So, on Saturday, I went. I dressed in a simple navy blue shift, a conscious rejection of mourning, but the fabric felt like a costume. Driving to Caroline's perfectly appointed colonial in her manicured suburb felt like piloting a vessel to another planet, one where the sun still shone and grass was still green and children laughed. My world had been reduced to shades of gray. The house was a cacophony of cheerful noise. A dozen relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral milled about, their voices too loud, their smiles too wide when they saw me. I felt their glances, a mixture of pity and awkwardness. "There's Eleanor, Robert's widow. Poor thing." I accepted their hugs, their murmured condolences, each one a small stone added to the weight I was carrying. My sister floated through the crowd, a vision in crisp yellow linen, her blonde bob unmussed. She pressed a cold glass of champagne into my hand. "Drink this, Ellie. It's a celebration." She smiled, but her eyes, the same shade of hazel as mine, darted over my face, assessing, calculating. She was always calculating. I found a quiet corner near the fireplace, away from the main cluster of guests. On the mantel, framed photographs documented Liam's first year. A red-faced newborn, a gummy smile at 6 months, a cherubic face smeared with cake. He was a beautiful boy, with Caroline's fair hair and her husband Mark's calm blue eyes. Mark caught my gaze from across the room and gave me a small, sympathetic smile. He was a good man, quiet and steady, often overshadowed by Caroline's radiant, demanding energy. I watched the scene unfold like a play I had no part in. My nephew, the birthday boy, was seated in his high chair, gleefully smashing a frosted cupcake in his fist. The adults cooed and laughed, snapping pictures. The joy in the room was a physical force, pushing against the numb shell I had built around myself. I felt like a ghost observing a life I could no longer touch. Robert should have been here with me. He would have stood beside me, his hand a steadying pressure on the small of my back, his presence a silent shield against the well-intentioned onslaught. The thought was a knife twist. It was then that Caroline, sensing the lull in the conversation, tapped her fork lightly against her champagne flute. The crystalline ting, ting, ting cut through the chatter, pulling all attention toward her.
"Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," she called out, her voice ringing with practiced ease. She beamed, a flawless, photogenic smile. Mark stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression one of proud affection. A hush fell over the room. I took a small sip of the champagne, the bubbles sharp and unwelcome on my tongue. I braced myself for the standard parental speech, the "we're so blessed, he's our miracle" soliloquy I'd heard at 100 such gatherings. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate our little Liam's first year," Caroline began, her gaze sweeping over the captivated faces. "It's been the most incredible journey. Becoming a mother, it changes you. It shows you what's truly important." She paused, her eyes glistening with what looked like genuine emotion. She looked directly at me. "And it makes you want to secure your child's future in every way possible." I felt a pang of something, envy perhaps, for the simple certainty of her world. Her concerns were about futures. Mine were about a past that had been abruptly severed. She squeezed Mark's hand. "We are so thrilled to be surrounded by so much love today, and we're so excited to share some wonderful news with you all, our dearest family." A ripple of anticipation went through the room. A few people glanced at her stomach. I thought, "Oh, she's pregnant again. That's the announcement." But Caroline's smile widened, and she looked right at me, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The air in the room seemed to grow still, charged with a sudden, unnameable tension. The happy chatter had died away completely, leaving a silence so profound I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart. Why was she looking at me like that? My grip tightened on the fragile stem of my champagne flute. Her voice, clear and deliberate, cut through the silence. She said, "We wanted you all to be the first to know," her words measured, each one dropping into the quiet like a stone into a still pond. With the incredible gift from Robert's life insurance policy finally settled, Mark and I have finally been able to make the down payment on our dream home on Nantucket. The world did not slow down. It stopped. The air was sucked from my lungs, the sounds of the party, the distant laughter, the clink of glass muffled into a dull roar in my ears. I stared at my sister, my beautiful, smiling sister, as her words echoed in the hollowed-out space Robert had left behind. A gift from Robert's life insurance policy? The phrase hung in the air, monstrous and incomprehensible. Robert had no life insurance policy, not a substantial one. We'd let the expensive one lapse years ago when he started his own business, deciding to put the extra money into the company. The only policy was a small, basic one through his former employer, just enough to cover the funeral expenses and maybe a few months of my mortgage. I had the check for a little under $15,000 sitting in my purse at that very moment. It was a pittance, a token. I looked at Mark. His smile was strained, tight at the corners. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the floor as if he'd found something fascinating in the pattern of the Persian rug. And then the final, devastating blow. Caroline's voice softened, dripping with a feigned saccharine sympathy that made my skin crawl. She said, "It's what he would have wanted," her gaze still locked on mine, a challenge and a declaration in her hazel eyes. The room began to tilt. The faces of my family swirled around me, a blur of confusion and dawning curiosity. Robert told her? When? Why? A coldness, sharper than any grief I had yet felt, began to spread from my core. icing my veins. This was no simple boast. This was a betrayal so profound, so calculated, that it reached across the veil of death itself to strike at the very foundation of the life I had shared with my husband. The glass in my hand felt dangerously fragile, and the happy, sun-drenched room now felt like a stage for a terrible, unfolding crime. What other secrets had my husband and my sister shared in the shadows?
The fragile stem of the champagne flute snapped between my fingers. The sound was a small, sharp punctuation in the stunned silence, a tiny explosion of reality. I didn't feel the cut, not at first. I only saw the fine line of crimson welling up on my thumb, a stark, living red against my pale skin. The shattered glass and the spilled champagne at my feet were a mess, an offense in Caroline's pristine world. All eyes, which had been fixed on her, swiveled to me. "Eleanor," my Aunt Clara gasped. But I couldn't look away from Caroline. Her expression was a masterclass in feigned concern, her brows knitted together, her lips forming a perfect O of surprise. But her eyes? Her eyes were triumphant. They glittered with a cold, hard light I had never seen before, or perhaps had simply refused to see. "He told me so himself." The words were a poison dart, still quivering in the center of my being. "Oh, Ellie, you've cut yourself!" Caroline exclaimed, her voice laced with a theatrical distress. She took a step toward me, but Mark's hand on her arm stopped her. He looked pale, his gaze darting from my face to the blood on my hand to his wife's composed features. He knew. Good God, the man knew. I'm fine," I managed to whisper, though my voice was a stranger's, thin and reedy. "It's nothing." I fumbled for a napkin from a nearby table, wrapping it tightly around my thumb. The physical pain was a welcome anchor, a simple, clean sensation in a maelstrom of psychological chaos. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a nervous buzz of conversation. People were suddenly very interested in their drinks, in the pattern on the carpet, in anything but the silent, seismic confrontation happening between the two sisters. The birthday boy, sensitive to the shift in atmosphere, began to whimper in his high chair. "Let me help you clean that up, Eleanor," Mark said, his voice low and strained. He moved toward me, grabbing a handful of napkins and bending to pick up the shards of glass. As he knelt, his head close to mine, he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it, "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. We can talk about this later." Later. The word was a dismissal, a postponement of the reckoning. I looked down at the top of his head, at the thinning spot in his neatly styled hair, and felt a surge of contempt so strong it stole my breath. He was complicit. He was living in a house, planning a dream life, funded by a secret my husband had shared with my sister. What else had they shared? The question was a viper uncoiling in the dark of my mind. I had to get out of there. The walls were closing in. The cheerful yellow of the living room now felt sickly. The laughter of my relatives a grotesque mockery of my internal screaming. I needed air. I needed the quiet, honest solitude of my grief, not this gilded, treacherous spectacle. "I need to go," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. "Don't be dramatic, Ellie. It was a shock, I know. We can discuss it like adults." "Stay. Have some cake for Liam." Discuss it like adults? As if she had announced a new car, not a financial and emotional betrayal that reached into my husband's grave. The sheer audacity of it, the cool, calculated delivery made my head spin.
This was not the impulsive, sometimes spoiled little sister I had protected and loved my whole life. This was a strategist. This was a stranger. "There is nothing to discuss," I said, meeting her gaze squarely for the first time since her announcement. The force of my stare seemed to startle her. "My husband was just buried, and you stand here in your beautiful home, surrounded by our family, and you tell me. I couldn't finish. The words were too vile to repeat. I turned and walked out of the living room. I didn't run. I walked with a dignity I did not feel, my back straight, the bloody napkin clutched in my fist. I heard the murmurs follow me, a wave of speculation and pity. I didn't care. Let them top. They hadn't just had their world, their past, their very marriage called into question.
The bright afternoon sun outside was an assault. I fumbled for my car keys, my hand shaking so violently I could barely press the unlock button. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of my car, of Robert's old leather jacket he left on the back seat, sending a fresh wave of agony through me. I gripped the steering wheel, resting my forehead against its cool, hard surface, and finally, I let the tears come. They were not the quiet, grieving tears I had shed for Robert. These were tears of rage, of confusion, of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical violation. I replayed the last months of Robert's life in my mind, the diagnosis, the brutal, swift decline, the precious, terrible hours spent in hospital rooms, and then, at the end, in our own bedroom, with a hospice nurse moving like a ghost in the background. Caroline had been there, of course. She'd brought food, she'd run errands, she'd sat with him when I had to sleep. I had been so grateful. I thought it was the crisis bringing us closer, mending the subtle rivalry that had always existed between us. Now I saw those moments in a new, horrifying light. The long afternoons she'd spent alone with him, reading to him, she said. The hushed conversations that would stop when I entered the room. I thought it was about his illness, his pain, things he didn't want to burden me with. I thought she was being a good sister, a good aunt, trying to spare me. The memory of her leaning close to his pillow, her blonde hair brushing his gaunt cheek, now made my stomach clench. Had she been comforting him, or had she been extracting something from him? A promise? A secret? What power could a dying man possibly hold that she would want to claim it for herself? And the money, a down payment on a house in Nantucket. That wasn't a small sum. That was life-changing money. Money Robert had never mentioned. Money that, by all rights, should have been mine. Had he lied to me all those years? Had there been a secret account, a hidden asset he'd kept from me, only to bequeath it to my sister in some deathbed sentimentality? The thought was insane, yet it was the only narrative that made a shred of sense. Robert was a good man, an honest man. He wouldn't have stolen. He wouldn't have deceived me on such a scale. Unless he wasn't the man I thought he was at all. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, a jarring sound in the quiet suburban street. I had to know. I couldn't go home to that empty, lily-scented house with this new festering wound. I had to find the truth. But where does one even begin to dig for a secret buried with the dead? The answer came to me with a chilling clarity, a path leading directly back into the heart of the life I'd just shared with Robert, a life that now seemed like a beautifully furnished stage set hiding a rotten foundation. I would have to start with the papers, the files, the digital footprints he left behind. I would have to become a detective in my own life, investigating the ghost of the man I loved. And the first clue, the only one I had, was that my sister felt secure enough to flaunt her prize in front of everyone we knew. She was certain there was no one left to contradict her. But she had underestimated the quiet, stubborn woman Robert had left behind. She had underestimated the wrath of a widow with nothing left to lose, a woman who now realized the funeral was over, but the real battle for her husband's legacy was just beginning. And the first skirmish had been declared not in a lawyer's office, but at a 1-year-old's birthday party, with the taste of champagne and blood in my mouth.
The drive home was a blur of streaking taillights and the frantic, rhythmic swipe of my windshield wipers. A late spring shower had begun, misting the world in a gray sheen that matched the static in my head. I drove on autopilot, my mind a cyclone of fractured images. Caroline's triumphant eyes, Mark's bowed head of shame, the shocking red of my own blood against the white napkin. But one thought rose above the chaos, cold and clear. I had to get to his office. Robert's small, home-based architecture firm had been his pride. The second-floor room, with its large drafting table and shelves bowed under the weight of design folios and structural engineering manuals, had been his sanctuary. Since his diagnosis, the door had been mostly closed, a silent monument to the career cut short. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go in there after he died. The thought of seeing his half-finished sketches, the coffee mug he'd forgotten to wash, the faint lingering scent of his pencil lead and sandalwood soap, it was a pain I had been postponing. Now, that room was no longer a shrine to grief. It was a crime scene. It held the evidence. It had to. I pulled into my driveway, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. The house loomed, dark and empty. I didn't hesitate. I walked inside, my wet shoes leaving dark prints on the hardwood floor, and went straight upstairs, bypassing my bedroom, bypassing the bathroom where his razor still sat on the sink. I stopped in front of the oak door to his office. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. It was unlocked. The room was exactly as he'd left it the last day he'd felt well enough to work. A thin layer of dust had settled over everything, muting the world. His large drafting table stood in the center, a complex design for a lake house still pinned to its surface, the lines precise and confident. A chill ran through me. This was his voice, his mind, preserved in graphite and paper. And I was about to rifle through it, looking for a lie. Where to even begin? His filing cabinets were a monument to his orderly mind, labeled and categorized. Taxes, client contracts, permits, personal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled open the drawer labeled personal. It was mostly old passports, the deed to the house, our marriage certificate, the wills we'd drawn up a decade ago. I pulled out the will, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. It was simple, straightforward, everything to me, a small bequest to a local conservation charity he loved. Nothing. Not a single mention of Caroline, of a secret policy, of Nantucket. A fresh wave of despair washed over me. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was my grief conjuring monsters where there were none? But no, the memory was too vivid, too searing. Caroline's voice ringing with certainty. He told me so himself. Frustrated, I turned to his desk. It was a beautiful old walnut partner's desk, a gift from me on his 50th birthday. He loved its hidden compartments and solid, dependable presence. I sat in his worn leather chair, the familiar creak a ghostly echo. I started with the obvious, the center drawer. Pins, paper clips, a spare set of keys. The side drawers held client correspondence, invoices, sketches, nothing out of the ordinary. It was when I ran my hands along the underside of the desk, a habitual gesture of affection I'd done 1,000 times, that my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. A small, almost imperceptible seam in the wood right near the back of the knee hole where no seam should be. My breath hitched. I'd bought him this desk. I knew every inch of it. This was new. I fetched a letter opener from the top drawer and with painstaking care wedged the tip into the tiny gap. There was a soft click. A small, thin panel of wood perfectly disguised as part of the desk's structure, swung inward, a hidden compartment. My blood ran cold. Robert, my straightforward, honest Robert, had a hidden compartment. Inside was not a stack of cash or a secret insurance policy. It was a single, sealed, legal-sized envelope. My name was written on the front in Robert's elegant architect's script, for Eleanor. But the second line stopped my heart dead in my chest. To be opened only in the event of my death, but only if Caroline Kensington discloses the existence of the Nantucket arrangement.
The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. He'd known she would do this. He'd anticipated this exact moment, this specific betrayal. This wasn't a secret he'd kept from me. It was a trap he'd set for her. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, charged with a terrifying finality. This was his voice, reaching out from beyond the grave, not with a confession, but with a weapon. What kind of arrangement had he made with my sister? And what terrible truth had he sealed inside this envelope? A truth he believed would only be safe for me to know after he was gone, and only if Caroline proved herself to be the person he suspected she was? The answers were right here, in my hands, but suddenly I was terrified to open it. The world I was about to uncover, the one my husband had meticulously documented and hidden away, was a world I was no longer sure I wanted to live in. The man I had loved and buried was a stranger, and the first words from his ghost were waiting in the silence, poised to shatter every remaining memory I had of our life together. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 68 years old. The story I am about to tell you is my own. It belongs to the tapestry of my life, a thread of such startling color that it forever changed the pattern of everything I thought I knew. It begins in the hollowed-out quiet that follows a great loss, and the days when the world feels muffled as if wrapped in thick felt. The black dress I had worn to bury Robert still hung over the chair in my bedroom, a shapeless shadow of a thing. The scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements clung to the air in my small house, a cloying, sweet smell of death that I couldn't seem to air out. It had been 3 days of silence, of casseroles left on the porch by well-meaning neighbors, of the unbearable emptiness of my side of the bed. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the stillness. It was my younger sister, Caroline. "Ellie," she said, her voice a forced, bright chirp. "You're coming on Saturday for Liam's birthday. You need to be around people." I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool wall. "Caroline, I can't. I'm not up for a party." "It's not a party. It's a small gathering, just family. For Liam. He needs his Aunt Ellie." Her tone brooked no argument, the same tone she'd used since we were children, when she'd decided she knew what was best for both of us. Robert had never cared much for Caroline. He called her the General in Pearls. The memory of his voice saying it, warm with wry amusement, was a fresh ache. So on Saturday, I went. I dressed in a simple navy blue shift, a conscious rejection of mourning, but the fabric felt like a costume. Driving to Caroline's perfectly appointed colonial in her manicured suburb felt like piloting a vessel to another planet, one where the sun still shone and the grass was still green, and children laughed. My world had been reduced to shades of gray. The house was a cacophony of cheerful noise. A dozen relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral milled about, their voices too loud, their smiles too wide when they saw me. I felt their glances, a mixture of pity and awkwardness. There's Eleanor, Robert's widow, poor thing. I accepted their hugs, their murmured condolences, each one a small stone added to the weight I was carrying.
My sister floated through the crowd, a vision in crisp yellow linen, her blonde bob unmussed. She pressed a cold glass of champagne into my hand. "Drink this, Ellie. It's a celebration." She smiled, but her eyes, the same shade of hazel as mine, darted over my face, assessing, calculating. She was always calculating. I found a quiet corner near the fireplace, away from the main cluster of guests. On the mantel, framed photographs documented Liam's first year. A red-faced newborn, a gummy smile at 6 months, a cherubic face smeared with cake. He was a beautiful boy, with Caroline's fair hair and her husband Mark's calm blue eyes. Mark caught my gaze from across the room and gave me a small, sympathetic smile. He was a good man, quiet and steady, often overshadowed by Caroline's radiant, demanding energy. I watched the scene unfold like a play I had no part in. My nephew, the birthday boy, was seated in this high chair, gleefully smashing a frosted cupcake in his fist. The adults cooed and laughed, snapping pictures. The joy in the room was a physical force, pushing against the numb shell I had built around myself. I felt like a ghost, observing a life I could no longer touch. Robert should have been here with me. He would have stood beside me, his hand a steadying pressure on the small of my back, his presence a silent shield against the well-intentioned onslaught. The thought was a knife twist. It was then that Caroline, sensing the lull in the conversation, tapped her fork lightly against her champagne flute. The crystalline ting, ting, ting cut through the chatter, pulling all attention toward her. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," she called out, her voice ringing with practiced ease. She beamed, a flawless, photogenic smile. Mark stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression of proud affection. A hush fell over the room. I took a small sip of the champagne, the bubbles sharp and unwelcome on my tongue. I braced myself for the standard parental speech. The "we're so blessed, he's our miracle" soliloquy I heard in hundreds of such gatherings.
Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate our little Liam's first year, Caroline began, her gaze sweeping over the captivated faces. It's been the most incredible journey. Becoming a mother, it changes you. It shows you what's truly important. She paused, her eyes glistening with what looked like genuine emotion. She looked directly at me. And it makes you want to secure your child's future in every way possible. I felt a pang of something, envy perhaps, for the simple certainty of her world. Her concerns were about futures. Mine were about a past that had been abruptly severed. She squeezed Mark's hand. "We are so thrilled to be surrounded by so much love today, and we're so excited to share some wonderful news with you all, our dearest family." A ripple of anticipation went through the room. A few people glanced at her stomach. I thought, oh, she's pregnant again. That's the announcement. But Caroline's smile widened, and she looked at me right away, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The air in the room seemed to grow still, charged with a sudden, unnameable tension. The happy chatter had died away completely, leaving a silence so profound I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart. Why was she looking at me like that? My grip tightened on the fragile stem of my champagne flute. Her voice, clear and deliberate, cut through the silence. She said, "We wanted you all to be the first to know. With the incredible gift from Robert's life insurance policy finally settled, Mark and I have finally been able to make the down payment on our dream home on Nantucket." The world did not slow down. It stopped. The air was sucked from my lungs. The sounds of the party, the distant laughter, the clink of glass muffled into a dull roar in my ears. I stared at my sister, my beautiful, smiling sister, as her words echoed in the hollowed-out space Robert had left behind. A gift from Robert's life insurance policy? The phrase hung in the air, monstrous and incomprehensible. Robert had no life insurance policy. Not a substantial one. We'd let the expensive one lapse years ago when he started his own business, deciding to put the extra money into the company. The only policy was a small basic one through his former employer, just enough to cover the funeral expenses and maybe a few months of my mortgage. I had the check for a little under $15,000 sitting in my purse at that very moment. It was a pittance, a token. I look at Mark. His smile was strained, tight at the corners. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the floor as if he'd found something fascinating in the pattern of the Persian rug. And then the final, devastating blow. Carolyn's voice softened, dripping with a feigned, saccharine sympathy that made my skin crawl. She said, "It's what he would have wanted." Her gaze still locked on mine, a challenge and a declaration in her hazel eyes. The room began to tilt. The faces of my family swirled around me, a blur of confusion and dawning curiosity. Robert told her? When? Why? A coldness, sharper than any grief I had yet felt, began to spread from my core, icing my veins. This was no simple boast. This was a betrayal so profound, so calculated, that it reached across the veil of death itself to strike at the very foundation of the life I had shared with my husband. The glass in my hand felt dangerously fragile, and the happy, sun-drenched room now felt like a stage for a terrible, unfolding crime. What other secrets had my husband and my sister shared in the shadows?
The envelope was a physical weight, a leaden rectangle that contained not just paper, but the potential to vaporize my entire past. To be opened only in the event of my death, but only if Caroline Kensington discloses the existence of the Nantucket arrangement. Robert's foresight was no longer comforting, it was terrifying. He hadn't just suspected Caroline, he had predicted her actions with the cold precision of a chess master planning an endgame from his deathbed. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely slide my thumb under the flap. The paper tore with a sound like a gasp. Inside were several pages. The first was a letter, in Robert's hand. The sight of his writing, so familiar and so forever gone, sent a fresh, raw wave of loss through me. I had to steady myself against the desk, my vision blurring, before I could force myself to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Caroline has done the very thing I feared she might. I am so sorry, my love. Sorry for this deception, sorry for the pain this letter will cause, and sorrier still that I lacked the courage to tell you this while I still drew breath. But the truth is a complicated beast, and I chose to cage it, hoping it would never need to be unleashed. There is no life insurance policy. There never was. What Caroline is calling a gift is, in fact, a debt of silence. The words swam on the page. A debt of silence? I gripped the paper tighter, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. About 8 months ago, a few weeks after my diagnosis, Caroline came to see me alone. She said she had discovered something about Mark. She claimed she had evidence, emails, financial records, that he had been embezzling from his firm. Not a vast sum, but enough to constitute a felony. She was hysterical, not out of moral outrage, but out of fear. Fear of the scandal, of losing their home, their standing, of Mark going to prison and leaving her and Liam with nothing. She told me she had confronted him, and he had confessed. But her solution was not to make him repay the money or turn himself in. Her solution was to find a way to replace the funds before an annual audit, which was due in the coming fiscal year. She came to me for a loan, a massive loan, the exact amount she needed to make her problem disappear. I had to stop. my breath catching in my throat. Mark? Quiet, steady Mark? An embezzler? It seemed impossible. But Caroline's reaction, the panic, the desperate need to cover it up, that rang terrifyingly true. Image was everything to her. I refused, Ellie. Of course I refused. We didn't have that kind of money liquid, and even if we did, it would be enabling a crime. I told her Mark had to face the consequences. She became different. A side of her I had always sensed, but never seen fully unveiled. Cold, calculating. She said if I didn't help her, she would tell you a different story. She would tell you that our relationship, ours, Ellie, had not been entirely platonic. The air left my lungs in a rush. I actually staggered back a step, the letter crinkling in my fist. I felt the world drop out from under me. She threatened to tell me that she and Robert. A wave of nausea so violent hit me that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth. The sheer, malicious genius of it was breathtaking. She had chosen the one accusation, the one seed of doubt that could poison every single memory I had, that could make a mockery of my entire marriage. And she had threatened to plant it while my husband was dying, to torment us both in his final days. She knew you would believe her, Ellie. She said you'd always been secretly jealous of her youth, her ease in the world. She said the doubt would fester in you forever, that it would be the last terrible memory you had of me, and I was weak. I was dying. The thought of leaving you with that horrific false narrative eating away at you, I couldn't bear it. I would rather you thought me a fool with money than a faithless husband. So I made a deal with the devil.
My eyes flew to the next page. It was a legal document, a promissory note. It stated that Robert Vance promised to pay Caroline Kensington the sum of $285,000 to be dispersed from his estate upon his death. The terms were clear, the amount staggering, but it was the final clause that made my blood run cold. This debt is contingent upon the mutual and permanent silence of both parties regarding all discussions that precipitated this agreement, specifically any and all allegations of a personal or financial nature. He hadn't given her a gift. He had paid her off. He had bought her silence with a fortune we didn't have to protect my memory of him and of us. But the money wasn't real. The policy wasn't real. So where had it come from? My eyes fell on the last document in the envelope. It was a bank statement from an account I had never seen before, in only Robert's name. The balance was $285,000, and the transaction history showed a single, massive withdrawal dated the day after Robert's funeral. The payee? Caroline Kensington. He had sold his business, the small, beloved architecture firm that had been his life's work, the practice he'd built from nothing. He'd sold it quietly while he was sick and hidden the money. He'd liquidated his dream to pay a blackmailer to protect me. He had died thinking he had saved me from a terrible lie, only to have that same blackmailer parade her blood money as a generous gift in front of our entire family. The cruelty of it was so exquisite, it was almost a work of art. Caroline hadn't just taken the money, she had twisted the narrative, making herself the grateful beneficiary of my husband's dying wish, while I, the widow, sat destitute and bewildered. She had stolen his legacy, his final act of love for me, and worn it as a crown. And in doing so, she had violated the very agreement she had extorted from him. She had broken the silence. The one thing I now held in my hands was the truth Robert had died to protect, a truth that was now my only weapon. The game was no longer hers to control. The pawn had just picked up the queen. The silence in the office was no longer empty. It was charged, humming with the ghost of my husband's furious protective love and the vile echo of my sister's extortion. I carefully placed the pages back into the envelope, my movements slow and deliberate, as if handling a live explosive. The trembling had stopped, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled in my bones like frost. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. Rage was a fire that would burn too hot and too fast. What I felt now was something else entirely, a focused, implacable resolve. I had the truth. But truth in a sealed envelope was a sword in a scabbard, powerful but useless unless drawn. I needed a plan. A confrontation in a restaurant or another family gathering would be useless. Caroline would simply lie, spin another web of tears and half-truths, painting me as the unhinged, grieving widow. I needed irrefutable, undeniable proof presented in a way that would strip her of all her defenses and expose the rotten core of her actions to the one person whose opinion, for once, actually mattered. Mark. The thought of Mark brought me up short. He was complicit in the cover-up of his own crime, living in a house of cards built with my husband's money. But the man I saw at the party wasn't a triumphant conspirator. He was a man drowning in shame. Had Caroline forced his hand too? Was he another of her victims, trapped by his own mistake and her ruthless ambition to hide it? I couldn't afford sympathy, not yet. But I could use his position. He was the key. I spent the next hour making copies. I copied Robert's letter, the promissory note, the bank statement. I used the old scanner in his office, the mechanical whirring in the green scanning light feeling like a sacred ritual, a preservation of evidence against the coming storm. I placed the originals back in the hidden compartment, my ace in the hole. The copies went into my own purse, and a second set into a sealed envelope that I addressed to my lawyer, a shrewd, discreet woman named Amanda Rossi, who had handled our estate planning. I wouldn't mail it yet, but it was my insurance. Then I sat back at Robert's desk, my mind racing. How does one corner a viper without getting bitten? I couldn't just show up at their door. Caroline would never allow me a private moment with Mark. I needed him to come to me, on my turf, away from her influence. I needed to craft a lure he wouldn't be able to resist. An idea began to form, delicate and dangerous. It relied on Mark's own guilt, on the sliver of decency I still believed lived within him. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I couldn't call his cell. Caroline might see the log. An email was too formal, too easily intercepted. A text message then. Short, cryptic, and utterly compelling. I typed slowly, choosing each word with the care of a bomb disposal expert. Mark. It's Eleanor. I found the documents Robert left for me in his desk, the ones about the arrangement with Caroline. I know about the promissory note. I know it wasn't a gift. I think we need to talk before this goes any further. Just you. Come to my house tomorrow at 10 a.m. If Caroline comes with you, I will take everything directly to the partners at your firm and the district attorney. Please don't make me do that. I read it over 3 times. It was a threat, but a measured one. It offered him a path out, a chance to control the narrative, while making the consequences of refusal terrifyingly clear. I held my breath and pressed send. The response was almost immediate. 3 pulsing dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. He was typing, deleting, retyping. The tension in the room was a physical presence. Finally, a single stark word came through. Okay. That was it. Okay. The simplicity of it was more unnerving than a long explanatory paragraph. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't arguing. He was capitulating. I had my meeting. Now I had to prepare for it. What would I say? What would I demand? The money was gone, spent on a down payment for a house by the sea. Robert was gone. Nothing could truly be made right. But some form of justice, some public acknowledgement of the truth,
That was still within reach. Or was I just setting the stage for a more devastating, more final confrontation, one that would not only shatter my sister's life but forever bury any last remnant of the family I thought I had? The quiet of the house seemed to press in on me, waiting as I sat in the gathering dark, the phone still glowing in my hand with that one fateful word. The calm before the storm was over. The clouds were now gathering on the horizon, and I was the one who had summoned them.
The night was endless, a slow, torturous crawl through a landscape of imagined conversations and dreaded outcomes. I rehearsed 100 different opening lines, each one feeling either too weak or too confrontational. I paced the quiet, dark rooms of my house, Robert's absence a palpable void in every shadowed corner. By the time the gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I was exhausted, wired on cold coffee and a simmering nervous energy. I dressed with care, choosing a simple tailored dress of charcoal gray. I wanted to look composed, formidable, a woman not to be trifled with. I was no longer the grieving widow. I was the executor of my husband's final, furious wish. At exactly 1 minute past 10, a dark sedan pulled into my driveway. My heart leapt into my throat. I watched from the window as Mark got out. He was alone. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shoulders slumped, his usual crisp appearance rumpled. He walked to my front door like a man heading to the gallows. I opened the door before he could knock. We stood for a moment staring at each other on the threshold. The cheerful brother-in-law from the birthday party was gone, replaced by a haunted middle-aged man whose world was about to collapse. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gravelly. "Mark, come in." I led him to the living room, not the cozy kitchen where family gathered, but the formal space we rarely used. I took the armchair, leaving him the sofa. He perched on the edge of the cushion, unable to relax. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You got my text," I finally said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I did." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Look, Eleanor, whatever you think you know." I didn't let him finish. I reached into the manila folder on the side table and slid the copy of the promissory note across the coffee table toward him. "I know that Robert didn't give you a gift. I know that he paid Caroline $285,000 in exchange for her silence. Her silence about what, Mark?" He stared at the document, his face bleaching of all color. He looked as if I'd physically struck him. All the prepared denial seemed to evaporate from his mind. He simply deflated, his body sagging into the sofa. "She told you," he whispered, not to me, but to the room, to the universe. "She actually told you." "Not the truth," I said coldly. "She announced it as a generous deathbed gift from her beloved brother-in-law. She made a spectacle of it. She broke the agreement." A bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh escaped him. Of course she did. The one thing she was supposed to do, keep her mouth shut, and she couldn't even manage that. She had to gloat. "So it's true," I pressed, my heart hammering. "The embezzlement. It's true." He looked up at me then, and the raw shame in his eyes was answer enough. It wasn't how it sounds," he began, his voice desperate. "It was a temporary liquidity issue. A client was late on a massive payment, and I had investors to pay. I shifted some funds. I was going to pay it all back before the audit. I swear to God I was. But the client defaulted. The hole was deeper than I could fix. Caroline found out when she was balancing our checkbook. She went nuclear. And her solution was to blackmail my dying husband," I stated, the words like chips of ice. He flinched. "She didn't call it that. She said it was a loan from family, a way to protect us, to protect Liam. She said Robert had the money from the sale of his firm. She made it sound almost reasonable." "Reasonable?" I leaned forward, my composure cracking. "She threatened to tell me that she and Robert were having an affair, Mark. She held that over his head while he was dying. Does that sound reasonable to you?" The blood drained from his face so completely I thought he might pass out. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. This,
it was clear, was a part of the story he had not been told. An affair? He stammered. No, she told me she'd threatened to tell you that Robert had made a pass at her once, years ago, when he was drunk. That it was awkward, but she'd forgiven him. She said she'd use it to suggest he was unstable, that his illness was affecting his judgment, not a full-blown affair. The horror in his voice was genuine. He had been a pawn in her game too, but he hadn't known how deeply monstrous the game truly was. The revelation hung between us, foul and toxic. We sat in silence, two wrecked people, connected by the devastating actions of the woman we had both, in our own ways, loved. "The money is gone, isn't it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded miserably. "The down payment. The rest is tied up in escrow for the Nantucket closing. We can't get it back. If we pull out now, we lose it all." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Eleanor, I am so sorry for everything. I was desperate. I was terrified of going to jail, of losing my son. I let her handle it. I knew it was wrong, but I was a coward." I believed him. He was a weak man who had made a terrible mistake and allowed a stronger, more vicious person to dictate the terms of his salvation. But understanding his weakness didn't solve my problem. It didn't bring the money back. It didn't restore Robert's legacy. "What happens now, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice small. "Are you going to go to the police?" I looked at him, at the broken man on my sofa, and I thought of Robert's letter. He hadn't wanted revenge. He had wanted to protect me. But Caroline had shattered that protection. She had forced my hand. "That depends on you, Mark," I said, my voice low and steady. "You're going to go home and you are going to tell Caroline that I know everything. The embezzlement, the blackmail, the specific, vile nature of her threat. You are going to tell her that I have the original documents and that I have sent copies to my lawyer. And then you are going to tell her what she is going to do next." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle on him. "She is going to call a family meeting at her house. And in front of the same people who heard her lie, she is going to tell them the truth. The whole, ugly, unvarnished truth. And she is going to sign over her half of our parents' inheritance trust to me, as restitution. Every last penny." Mark stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "She'll never agree to that. Never." "Then you will all go to jail," I said simply. "You for embezzlement, her for extortion and fraud. You will lose your son, your freedom, and every last shred of dignity you have left. This is the only way out I am offering you. A private humiliation or a public destruction. The choice is yours. But make no mistake, Mark," I said, standing up to signal the end of our meeting, my gaze cold and unwavering. "The choice is now yours to make. And if you choose wrong, I will have no mercy left for either of you. The widow you tried to cheat has nothing left to lose, and you are about to find out just how dangerous that can be." Mark left my house a broken man, his shoulders bowed under the weight of the ultimatum I had delivered. I watched him drive away, the sleek sedan moving slowly, as if the very vehicle were burdened. There was no satisfaction in it, only a hollow, grim certainty. I had lit the fuse. Now I had to wait for the explosion. The hours that followed were an exercise in surreal stillness. I tried to read, but the words blurred into nonsense. I tried to garden, but my hands shook as I pulled at the weeds. The vibrant green of the plants a shocking contrast to the moral decay festering in my heart. Every ring of the phone, every car that passed on the street sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I was waiting for the call, the scream, the inevitable backlash from my sister. It didn't come that day. The silence from their end was, in its own way, more terrifying than any outburst. It gave Caroline time to think, to scheme, to marshal her forces. What was happening in that perfect colonial house? Was Mark showing a spine for the first time in his marriage? Or was Caroline systematically dismantling his resolve, weaving a new, even more intricate web of lies to ensnare him and defeat me? The following morning, the sun rose on a world that felt charged and dangerous. I was in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking, when my phone finally vibrated on the countertop. It wasn't Caroline, it was Mark. The text was terse, a battlefield communique. She agreed. Tonight, 7 p.m. My breath caught. She agreed? Just like that? It seemed too easy. Caroline never capitulated. She negotiated. She manipulated. She prevailed. Her immediate agreement was a red flag waving in a hurricane. What was her play? What did she have waiting for me? The day was a slow-motion countdown. I dressed again in the charcoal gray dress, my armor. I placed the original documents from Robert's compartment into my purse, along with the copies. I was a general preparing for a final, decisive battle, checking my weapons one last time. At 6:59 p.m., I pulled up to their house for the second time in a week. The last time I had been a grieving ghost. Tonight, I was an avenging spirit. The house looked the same, cheerful, welcoming, light spilling from the windows, but now I knew it for what it was. A beautifully maintained facade hiding a foundation of secrets and corruption. I didn't ring the bell. I walked in. The living room was set up similarly to the birthday party, but the atmosphere was polar opposite. The bright balloons were gone. The only people there were Mark, standing stiffly by the fireplace, and Caroline, seated regally on the sofa. She was dressed in a simple black sheath, her makeup flawless, her posture erect. She looked like a queen prepared for a beheading, her dignity intact, even in defeat. Liam was nowhere to be seen. "Ellie," she said, her voice cool, devoid of its usual chirping brightness, no pretense of a smile. "Caroline." I remained standing near the doorway, not willing to give them the psychological advantage of me sitting. Mark looked from her to me, his face a mask of anguish. "Eleanor's here," he said unnecessarily. "So I see," Caroline replied, her gaze never leaving mine. "Well, it seems you've been busy, big sister, digging through a dead man's desk. It's a rather ghoulish hobby, don't you think?" Her attack was so swift, so brazen, it almost took my breath away. She wasn't going to admit fault. She was going on the offensive. I felt the first cold trickle of doubt. I had underestimated her capacity for audacity. I prefer to think of it as executing my husband's final wishes, wishes you were paid $250,000 to keep, and which you then flaunted at your son's birthday party. You broke the agreement, Caroline. You forced my hand. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture so casual it was an insult. "That document is meaningless. The ramblings of a sick, confused man. He was on heavy medication. He didn't know what he was signing." I felt a hot spike of fury. "He was lucid until the very end, and you know it. He sold his business, the work of his lifetime, to pay you off, to keep you from poisoning my mind with your filth." For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure, a tiny flicker in her eyes. She hadn't known he'd sold the firm. She had thought it was savings, an insurance policy. The knowledge that he had liquidated his dream for this hit its mark, but she recovered instantly. "You always saw yourself as the victim, didn't you, Eleanor?" she said, her voice dripping with a sudden startling venom. "Saint Eleanor, so long-suffering, so righteous. Well, let me tell you something. Robert wasn't the saint you think he was.
He was weak. He folded the moment I applied a little pressure. He cared more about your idealized memory of him than he did about the truth. He chose to buy a lie rather than trust you with the reality. What does that say about your perfect marriage? Her words were like shards of glass, designed to maim, and they found their target, because a small, hidden part of me had wondered the same thing. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he chosen to bear that burden alone? The doubt she had threatened to plant was now sprouting in the toxic soil she had provided. I took a step forward, my purse feeling like a lead weight. This isn't about your marriage. This is about your crime. You extorted a dying man. You are a blackmailer. I looked at Mark. And you are an embezzler. I have the proof. I have the promissory note, Robert's letter, the bank records. It's all here. I tapped my purse. And copies are with my lawyer. Mark winced, looking at the floor. But Caroline's smile was thin and cruel. Go ahead, she dared me, her voice a low, challenging hiss. Take it to the police. Ruin us. But ask yourself this, Eleanor, while you're at it. What will it do to Liam? His father in prison, his mother branded a criminal? He'll be the boy whose parents are felons. Is that the legacy you want to give in Robert's name? To destroy an innocent child's future to soothe your own bruised pride? The room went silent. She had played her trump card. Not a denial, not an excuse, but a threat wrapped in maternal concern. She was holding her own son hostage, using his future as a human shield against the consequences of her actions. She was betting that my love for Liam, my basic human decency, was stronger than my thirst for justice. And as I stood there, staring into her victorious, merciless eyes, I realized with a sickening lurch that she might be right. I had come for a confession, but I had walked into a much more devastating moral trap. The battlefield had just shifted beneath my feet, and I was no longer sure which way was forward, or what victory would even cost.
The air in the room was thick enough to choke on. Caroline's question hung between us, not as a question at all, but as a declaration of her victory. She had pivoted from defendant to moral arbiter, and in doing so, she had checkmated me. My righteous anger, my demand for public shame, my entire plan, it all crumbled against the image of Liam, my beautiful, innocent nephew, growing up in the shadow of a scandal I had unleashed. She knew me. She knew I couldn't do it. I looked at Mark. His face was ashen, his eyes pleading. He was silently begging me to stand down, to accept this monstrous new reality where his crime and her extortion were to be buried for the sake of their child. He was a coward, but in this, he was a father. The conflict in his gaze was a mirror of the war raging inside me. Caroline saw my hesitation, the slight slump in my shoulders, and she pressed her advantage, her voice softening into a manipulative croon. We all make mistakes, Ellie. Mark made a terrible error in judgment. I was terrified, and I handled it poorly. I see that now. But we have a chance to fix this, to move forward, together, as a family. If you do this, if you go to the police, you don't just punish us. You punish Liam for the rest of his life. You will have taken his father away. Is that what Robert would have wanted? She was using Robert's memory as a cudgel now, twisting his protective love into a justification for her own immunity. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it stole my breath. I felt the fight draining out of me, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She had thought of everything. What then? I asked, my voice hollow. The money is gone. Robert's legacy is gone. You humiliated me in front of our family. You expect me to just, what, forgive and forget? The Nantucket house, Mark began, his voice raspy. We can't get the down payment back, but once it sells, the equity. It will take months, Caroline cut him off sharply, her eyes warning him to be silent. She turned back to me, her expression of magnanimous concession. But you are right. Robert's business, that money, it should have been yours. We will sign over my half of the inheritance trust.
As you said, it's not the full amount, but it's something. It's a start. We can make this right, Ellie. Privately, without destroying everyone in the process. It was the exact demand I had made of Mark, but now, coming from her, it felt like a defeat. She was offering me a consolation prize, a payout to buy my silence, just as Robert had paid for hers. The symmetry was sickening. I would become a party to the cover-up, complicit in the very corruption I sought to expose. I would be taking hush money. I looked around the beautiful, sterile living room, at my sister's perfectly composed face, at my brother-in-law's shame-filled eyes. This was the sum total of my victory, a quiet financial settlement, and the bitter knowledge that the truth would be buried forever, all to protect a child from the sins of their parents. It was the pragmatic adult solution. It was also a soul-crushing compromise. "I need the documents," I said, my voice flat. "The promissory note, Robert's letter, I want the originals." A flicker of surprise crossed Caroline's face. She hadn't expected me to agree so quickly. She recovered, nodding. "Of course. They're in our safe." "Get them," I commanded. Mark moved first, almost tripping in his haste to leave the room. He returned a moment later with a small fireproof box. He fumbled with the combination and retrieved the familiar envelope. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine, a fleeting, pathetic contact. I took it, the paper feeling toxic in my hands. This was the proof. This was Robert's voice, and I was about to silence it forever. "The trust paperwork," I said, my gaze locked on Caroline. "I'll have my lawyer draw it up. You will sign it without argument." She inclined her head, a queen granting a favor. "Agreed." There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out of the house for what I knew in my heart would be the last time. I didn't look back. The night air was cool on my face, a relief after the suffocating atmosphere inside. I drove home through the dark, empty streets, the envelope on the passenger seat beside me. I had what I came for. I had secured a financial future. I had, in some twisted way, won. But as I pulled into my own dark, silent driveway, a profound emptiness opened up inside me, wider and deeper than any grief I had yet felt for Robert. I had traded justice for practicality. I had allowed my sister to frame my mercy as her victory. I had preserved the family's outward peace by allowing a cancerous secret to grow unchecked at its core. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the only sound the soft ticking of the cooling metal. I had the originals, but I also had the copies. And as I sat there in the consuming dark, a new, terrifying thought began to form. One that had nothing to do with lawyers or money or fragile family truces. This wasn't about restitution anymore. It was about something far more primal. Caroline believed the game was over, that she had once again outmaneuvered me. But she had forgotten one crucial thing. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous when it appears to surrender. And as I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward my lonely house, the weight of the originals in my bag felt less like a settlement and more like the first piece of evidence in a new, far more personal and final reckoning. The war was not over. It had simply entered a new, much colder phase. The silence in my house was no longer a void to be endured. It was a workshop. In the days that followed, a strange, cold calm settled over me. The frantic energy of discovery and confrontation had burned away, leaving behind a core of polished, glacial resolve. I met with Amanda Rossi, my lawyer. I handed her the trust transfer paperwork, explaining it as a long overdue family financial rebalancing, a final settling of accounts after Robert's passing. She, being sharp and discreet, asked no probing questions, though her eyes lingered on my composed face a moment too long. The machinery of the law was set in motion, a clean, clinical process that stood in stark contrast to the moral swamp it was dredging. I banked the money from the trust without a flicker of emotion. It was blood money, twice over. First from Robert, now from Caroline. It felt cold and dead in my account. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the story. Caroline had told her version, the generous brother-in-law, the dream home, and I had, through my silence, seemingly acquiesced to it. But a story that isn't challenged becomes history, and I could not let her version of history stand. I began my work in Robert's office, now my command center. I didn't touch the hidden compartment. That was a relic of the First War. This was a new campaign, fought with different weapons. I started with the digital ghost he had left behind, his old laptop, his email archives, the cloud storage he used for backing up his designs. I was no expert, but grief and fury are powerful teachers. I spent hours scrolling, searching, piecing together a timeline. I found the email chain with the commercial realtor, discussing the quiet, urgent sale of his firm's assets and client list. I found the bank transfer confirmations into the secret account. Each digital footprint was a nail in the coffin of Caroline's lie, a testament to the calculated, desperate act of a man protecting his wife from a truth he deemed too cruel. I compiled it all, not for a court of law, but for the court of family opinion. But it wasn't enough. Documents were cold. I needed a voice. And then I remembered the dictation. Robert, ever the efficient architect, had often used a voice recorder app on his phone to capture ideas, notes to his draftsman, reminders to himself. He'd synced it to his cloud account. My heart hammered as I navigated to the folder. There were hundreds of files, most labeled with project names or dates. I started with the files from the final months, my stomach a tight knot of dread and hope. I listened to his voice, so familiar and so agonizingly alive in my headphones. Notes about soffit details, messages to his assistant about rescheduling client meetings, and then I found it. A file dated just a week after Caroline's initial threat. His voice was thinner, wearier, the robust baritone softened by the disease that was consuming him. But his mind was razor sharp. Audio note to self. October 14th. Met with Caroline today. A disaster. She's uncovered Mark's mess. She came to me for a bailout, a massive one. I refused. Then she showed her true colors. Threatened to tell Ellie that we'd been involved. An affair. The one accusation, the one lie that would fester forever. I saw it in her eyes. She'll do it. She'll poison everything we have, everything we are, just to save her own skin. I can't. I can't let that be my last gift to my wife. That doubt, that horror. I have to find the money. I have to sell the practice. It's the only way to buy her silence. God forgive me for this deception, but I cannot leave Ellie with that image in her mind. It would be a death for her long after I'm gone. I sat back, tears streaming down my face, not of sadness, but of a furious, vindicated love. Here it was, not a theory, not a letter to be dismissed as the rambling of a sick man, but his voice, in the moment, raw and real and utterly damning. This was the truth captured in his own weary, heartbroken words. I had everything I needed now. The documents laid out the financial trail. His voice laid bare the emotional extortion. Together, they were irrefutable. But sending this out in an email, a mass text, it would be an explosion, yes, but a messy, undignified one. It would be my word, my evidence against their silence. They could still paint me as the vengeful, unhinged widow.
Now, this required a specific, deliberate audience. This required a stage. An idea, both terrible and perfect, began to crystallize.
The annual family Labor Day picnic was in 3 weeks. It was a tradition, held at my cousin's sprawling backyard. Everyone would be there. Everyone who had been at the birthday party, who had heard Caroline's triumphant announcement. It was the perfect arena. A public reckoning required a public venue. I would not scream. I would not accuse. I would be calm. I would be prepared. I would ask Caroline in front of everyone to clarify the generous nature of Robert's gift. And when she inevitably repeated her lie, smiling her brittle smile, I would have the means to play my husband's voice for them all, to let the dead man himself rise and testify from beyond the grave, to lay bare the ugly, venal truth in the bright, unforgiving light of a late summer day. It was a nuclear option. It would scorch the earth. It would forever shatter any semblance of a family. But as I listened to Robert's recording one more time, to the love and despair in his voice, I knew with a chilling certainty that some fields need to be burned clean so that something new, something honest, can have a chance to grow. The quiet widow was done being quiet. The final act was being written, and this time I was holding the pen.
The 3 weeks until the Labor Day picnic were a study in suspended animation. Life went on in its mundane, surface-level way. I tended my garden. I grocery shopped. I even had coffee with an old friend, making polite conversation while a countdown clock ticked relentlessly in the back of my mind. I was a sleeper agent, moving through the world with a placid smile, all while preparing for a single, devastating mission. I transferred the audio file to a small portable speaker. I printed clean copies of the most critical documents, the promissory note, the bank statement showing the withdrawal to Caroline. I placed them in a fresh folder. I was not just preparing evidence, I was assembling a theater of truth. The morning of the picnic dawned bright and clear, a perfect late summer day, the kind meant for laughter and citronella candles and children chasing fireflies. I dressed in a simple light blue linen shift. I wanted to look peaceful, unthreatening. My weapons were hidden in a large, soft-sided tapestry bag. The folder, the small speaker, my phone to activate it. I felt a surreal detachment as I drove to my cousin Patricia's house, as if I were watching myself in a film. The backyard was already buzzing when I arrived. The same cast of characters from the birthday party was there, scattered across the lawn on checkered blankets and folding chairs. The air smelled of grilled meat and sunscreen. I saw Mark first, manning the barbecue, his movements stiff and automatic. He saw me and flinched, almost dropping a spatula. Then I saw Caroline. She was holding court at a picnic table, Liam on her lap, surrounded by a group of aunts. She was wearing white, a picture of summery innocence. She looked up, and our eyes met across the lawn. Her smile didn't falter, but it tightened, becoming a brittle porcelain thing. She gave me a small, regal nod. I returned a faint, non-committal smile. I made the rounds, accepting a plate of food I wouldn't eat, exchanging pleasantries I wouldn't remember. I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment, when the group was most settled, most cohesive. The perfect happy family tableau needed to be fully assembled before I introduced the crack in the canvas. The moment came as the sun began to dip lower, casting long golden shadows. Dessert was being served. Berry pies and vanilla ice cream. People were clustered together, sated and relaxed. Caroline was now sitting in a circle of lawn chairs with Patricia, our Uncle Frank, and a few others. It was the core of the family. It was time. I walked over, my tapestry bag slung over my shoulder. I pulled up an empty folding chair and joined their circle. "Ellie, so glad you could make it," Patricia said, her smile warm and genuine. "It's a beautiful day." "It reminds me of Liam's birthday. Such a lovely party," I replied. My voice was calm. I looked directly at Caroline. "It was, wasn't it? A wonderful day to celebrate." "It was," I agreed, my tone conversational. "And such wonderful news you shared with everyone about the new house on Nantucket. We were all so happy for you."
The small circle fell attentive. Uncle Frank nodded. A beautiful spot, Nantucket. Robert always had good taste. He did, I said, still looking at Caroline. It was so incredibly generous of him. That gift from his life insurance policy. I tilted my head slightly, a picture of innocent curiosity. You know, it's been on my mind. With all the paperwork after a death, it's just so complicated. I've been going through everything, and I have to admit, I'm a little confused. Caroline's smile was now firmly frozen in place. Oh, confused about what, Ellie? Her voice was light, but there was a blade of steel beneath it. Well, I opened my tapestry bag slowly, deliberately. I pulled out the folder on my lap, making a show of scanning the top document. I only see the small one from his old job. It's had me so puzzled. I was hoping you could clarify it for me. For all of us, how exactly did that work? The air in our little circle went still. The chatter from the rest of the picnic seemed to fade into a distant hum. Patricia and Uncle Frank were looking at Caroline, their expressions shifting from casual interest to curiosity.
Caroline's eyes were locked on mine, hard and hateful. She gave a tight, dismissive laugh. Oh, Ellie, you know how these things are. It was probably a private policy. He was always so private about his business. It's really not important. But it is important, I said softly, my voice carrying in the quiet. You see, I did find a transaction, a very large one. I lifted the bank statement, holding it so the others could see the payee line. $285,000 withdrawn from Robert's account the day after his funeral. Paid to you, Caroline. A collective, sharp intake of breath from the circle. Uncle Frank's genial face was now a mask of confusion. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Caroline's composure finally cracked. A flush crept up her neck. That was the gift. That's what I'm talking about. This is ridiculous, Eleanor. This is beneath you. Are you really so jealous of our good fortune that you'd resort to this spectacle? A gift? I repeated, my voice still calm, though my heart was thundering. Given in exchange for what, Caroline? She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the flagstone patio. I will not sit here and be interrogated by you. You're clearly not well. You're obsessed. I have his voice, Caroline. And my quiet statement cut through her outburst like a knife. She froze, her eyes wide with a new primal fear. What? I reached into my bag and retrieved the small speaker. I placed it on the empty seat of my chair. The entire backyard was silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on us. Robert kept audio notes, Caroline. He recorded his thoughts, especially when he was troubled. I picked up my phone. He recorded one on October 14th. Would you like to hear what was troubling him that day? Would you like to hear what he thought of your gift? Don't you dare, he whispered, her voice a venomous thread. I looked at the faces of my family, at their confusion and dawning alarm. This was for them. This was for the truth. I think we all need to hear it, I said, and I pressed play. Robert's voice, weary and heartbreakingly familiar, filled the hushed backyard. Audio note to self, October 14th. Met with Caroline today. A disaster. As his words unfolded, the story of Mark's embezzlement, her threat, the vile nature of her blackmail, I watched the world I knew fracture in real time. I saw the dawning horror on Patricia's face, the disgust on Uncle Frank's. I saw Mark, by the grill, bury his face in his hands, and I saw Caroline, standing rigid in her white dress, her perfect life unraveling with every word from the ghost she had thought she had silenced. She was exposed, utterly and completely, not by me, but by the man she had betrayed. The performance was over. The truth, raw and ugly and final, was now the only thing left standing in the quiet, golden light of the falling sun.